is Mary MATZEK with Public Access Television, and we're here today with the Snyder family. This is John Snyder from Valley Springs, and this is his daughter. Her real name is Mary Ann Stroyan. No, it's got a silent J. It's Stroyan. But everyone calls her Moon. That's what they tell me anyway. So we have Moon and John. Now, I know a little bit about the Snyders. I've always thought they were new to the county, and I know that the Snyder Ranch is fairly well known for its
MATZEK, Rockhound powwow.
Oh yes, the powwow. So we go to the Valley Springs for the powwow, and as I recall, you had an interesting, that kind of started in an interesting way. How did that work, John?
We have lived at Valley Springs for about 45 years, and and we have this moss agate deposit on our property. About 45 years ago, a man showed up at our front door one Saturday morning and asked if he could go rock hounding. We didn't know what rock hounding was, but he...
A new term at the time, huh?
Right. But he told us that he had a group of about 20 people with him who wanted to go in on our property and dig this semi-precious stone, moss agate, and that they would be willing to pay for the privilege of using our ranch.
Real money.
As a collecting site. Well, it certainly was 45 years ago.
Yeah.
But to make a long story short, they went in, collected some rock, came out, gave us $90 in cash. And my wife Betty and I thought, if you can make this kind of money accidentally, what could you do if you worked at it? And so about 20 years ago, we started this
So you've been doing the powwow then for 20 years?
I believe this is the 19th annual one
kind of like official.
Here.
I see.
Right. And it has grown from a few hundred people coming into the ranch, dealers in gemstones and equipment were set up, sales.
But what has that meant to you as a rancher? I mean, did you receive some criticism for the fact that you would have people on, I mean, you're supposed to be a rancher, I mean, this is cows, right?
Oh, surely. Well, I think that's one thing. Most people who own real estate don't want to have anybody else on it. They don't want to share it with anyone, but we kind of feel the good Lord let us use this real estate, and so we like to share it with our fellow man.
Well, maybe that's why I thought you guys were newcomers.
And I think all they expected for him was to do was, if you found the gate closed, keep it closed. If you found it open, keep it open and pick up your
trash.
And that was all they asked.
That was nice, and it's been a lovely tradition and a lovely celebration. But of course, you guys aren't new to the county, as I thought, and so as some other people think.
Oh no.
So you go back a long way, and today we're going to be talking about the Snyder family history. And why don't we start with you, Moon? Weren't you the one that kind of got interested in the family history somehow?
Yeah, well, just one afternoon I started asking questions. You heard about the Snyder family from Murphy's and who they were. And
yes, there are other Snyders besides John.
Yeah, and so I sat with my father and mother and wrote it on a paper bag. And the great-grandfather came over in the 1850s with his father and a couple of brothers and sisters, and we drew the top one, and then we started drawing the branches of the tree, and we ended up down here somewhere. And this whole
there's no more room on the paper bag. Yes, so, I think everyone does that. They kind of start in an unsophisticated manner, and then they end up going with the really nice pedigree sheets.
Well, and I think it's like going on a diet until you're really interested yourself. Nobody can talk you into it, I think.
Okay, so you guys, then, so what you did then is you decided to do your family tree, but why don't we go back and say, all right, who is who in the Snyder family? Like, who is John's father and John's father's father? How far can we go back?
Well,
go ahead.
My grandfather, Peter Snyder.
Okay, you're saying Schneider instead of Snyder.
Was born in 1832 in Alsace-Lorraine, Germany. Came to Murphy's in the early 50s.
How did you get here?
He came by boat from Europe to New York, then went by boat from New York down to the Isthmus of Panama, walked across the Isthmus of Panama, caught a boat going north up the west coast of Mexico and North America, landed in San Francisco.
About what year was this?
This would have been about 1850.
So he came basically for the gold rush then?
He came
pretty much hunting
for the
gold.
rush of the 40.
Was there also any extenuating circumstances? A lot of immigrants left because there were poor conditions at home,
I
too.
think he might have been the first draft dodger. I understand that he and his family left Germany so they wouldn't have to do military service under what they thought was imperialistic rulers.
Kind of a repressive regime, in a sense, or very maybe autocratic or something.
The rulers were, and I
Yeah.
think that my grandfather's family were literally peasants in Germany.
Had no privilege, and so they're...
That's right, and had a very small plot of land, maybe 2 acres, and they raised their own food, but barely existed. And I can remember my father telling how his father told him that when a horse went by your 2 acres in Germany, if there was manure deposited on the public road, that belonged to the person who owned the 2 acres or who farmed that 2 acres.
And it was actually a valuable commodity.
It certainly
seems
was.
extreme, but it had to be true. It had to be true.
That's
and
right.
it is that way. Okay, then you, you mentioned to me earlier about Snyder, the spelling of the name, and a love letter. Why don't you tell me about that, Moon?
Okay, well, the name, as we know it, is S-N-Y-D-E-R, but back in the old days, it was S-C-H-N-E-I-D-E-R. And they said that when he came through immigration, the immigration clerk asked him how you spell it, and he said, "Snitched," or, I mean, it doesn't matter. He didn't know. And so the immigration clerk shortened it to S-N-Y-D-E-R. And so in our history, we have to look for both spellings, and we can...
Oh, well, let's look at this letter, because I know that this is really neat.
Okay. Peter got to Murphy's in the 1850s, and then we inherited a lot of this treasures, and there was one letter from Pennsylvania Gulch in early part of 1860, and it's to my dearest girlfriend, to Barbara Household. I'd like to take this opportunity to write you what I feel. I write you this letter, and I have the feeling that a storm will come and it'll fall into the ocean. But what will be, will be. I was with you there in the brewery, but didn't think about the feeling I had for you. And then he goes on and keeps courting her. And it must have been successful because they got married in May of 1860.
And this is some of the beautiful old penmanship they used on those German letters. And of course, it was all in old German. You had to have them translated and everything. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, in fact, the German they learn today is a lot different than what they wrote in those days.
So, of course, now we've established that the Snyders and the Schneiders are one and the same. They're very German. They came for the gold rush and to escape repression in Germany. And now we have them. How did they get to Murphy's?
Well, they stopped in San Francisco, and they must have done some deals there, because we understand they had some land holdings they traded for property up here. And
okay, so they kind of settled in San Francisco first and then moved up to the gold rush area,
Yeah.
as a lot of people did.
yeah,
Right.
and we don't know how long they were there, but we do know they've been in Murphy's a long time.
Now, you mentioned the brewery and Murphy's, and of course you probably have some family photos of the Murphy's area, maybe early day Murphy's. I think
Yeah.
maybe our audience might be interested in what we have from Murphy's, or from anywhere in the county. Can you show me these?
Okay, this is, let's see, the pump hole at the west end of Murphy's, the water wheel, and the Snyder barn.
Oh, I know
Yeah.
that. I know that area.
Right. Well, the pump hole, I believe, still exists, although it's just a very small fragment of what it really...
Not too much water in it anymore.
That's right. But back in 1932, we had a 100-year family reunion at the old ranch, and the pump hole then was allegedly 60 feet deep.
Did the kids swim in it?
The kids in Murphy swam in it from my father's generation on to kids in my generation.
Who would that be in your father's generation?
Well, his brothers and sisters, he was one of 9 children, and he was a good friend of the Schwerer family.
Which,
many people remember Charles Schwerer, the superintendent of schools for about 40 years here.
Let me just for a minute point out to our audience where you're talking about now. I happen to know where the pump hole is, But the old Snyder family home then was next to the pump hole, which is where the Black Sheep Winery is today.
That's right, the barn.
In fact, that barn.
Right, the barn that is now the Black Sheep Winery, I believe my father had built in 1923. It replaced an older barn that had burned down on the same site.
So that's what we're talking about. And of course, the Schwer family owned the property right across,
right across
like what you would call Murphy's Grade Road or Main Street.
Right, it's now
kind of where the split goes for French Gulch Road.
Yeah. Now part of the Couts property or Hayes Station Ranch, it is known.
Yeah.
But even in my generation, I remember, like the Tanner brothers told me, we were fellow Boy Scouts in the county. And they used to swim in the pump hole, and all the kids in Murphy's. It was the place to go on a hot summer day and cool off.
Lovely old cold water.
And then the Snyders and the households own the pump hole.
Well, yes, the Housel property was to the east, and the Snyder property to the west, and there was a long-standing boundary dispute over just where the line was through the pump hole. I'm not just sure if that was ever
so we just take a block.
Settled.
Any block which fits
Now,
here.
did the Snyders somewhere marry with the Housels here?
Well, my grandfather, Peter Snyder, married Barbara Houselt, and yes, we are descendants of both the Snyders and the Houselts.
Yeah.
Okay, this is
Barbara Houselt, and this is Peter Snyder, and she's the youngest of 15 children.
Oh, my.
And 5 of them came to Murphy's. There was Conrad Houselt, and he'd be Ernie Houselt's grandfather that we know today.
Right.
And then a John Houselt, and he ended up over in Sheep Ranch with the Houselt Brewery.
Right.
And then Ernie can tell you some stories about the brewery wagon. And then 2 of their sisters married Heinsdorf and Seibel. And then Barbara was the youngest of them.
Oh.
And then we have a wedding dress.
Oh, and you... Okay, you said you had a wedding dress from Barbara.
That was her dress, and it's right here if you'd like to see it.
Oh, we'd love to see it.
I think they
I
had
forgot all about this.
they had one good dress in those days that they wore to their wedding and to every funeral.
And it had to go for all the dances and everything else. Why don't you stand up and show it?
Okay. It got it was in one piece, and it ended up in 2 pieces. But this is purple and black, and the last time I wore it was about 10 years ago. The Heritage Council had a...
Marvelous, you actually can get into it.
Well, yeah, and then the Heritage Council
Here,
had
hold that up,
I'll
I'll put it on the skirt.
The Heritage Council had a fashion show at the Thorn House, a benefit, and we all got to wear our old clothes.
Oh, this goes in the back. Look at all those pleats. My heavens, that's a lot of material. I sew a little bit, but I would never put that many pleats. I wouldn't want my waist to look that big. So that's the back, I guess. Yeah. Oh, gosh, this is neat. Oh, that's beautiful. It's really still in good shape, amazingly.
This was before the days of white wedding dresses, too.
Oh, that's right. I didn't know. I can't understand that. I always thought white wedding dresses were white. Was there a reason that they weren't? Or
Well, I think it's they wore the dress all their life to their funerals.
and white got dirty.
Yes, this is more practical. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
You know, it really is in good shape in many, many places.
Yeah.
Well, I'm covering up your waist, but I think you're beautiful, Moon. Thank you, Barbara Housel Snyder. Now, you have some other things here. This is, I can't remember, we talked briefly.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. Barbara and Peter got married in Columbia in 1860, and they went on and they had 10 children, 9 that lived into adulthood. And we were able to get the cap, the christening cap of the 10 children. And then this christening, let's see, this is her apron, but this was the christening gown that all the children
wore. Yes, you know, they wore, even the boys wore the long christening dresses.
Yeah.
It's just amazing.
Yeah,
I wonder why they did that, why they had to be so long, or why they made them so long. The old pictures, you know, where you see the baby being christened and just being held like a gift, and the dress is streaming down. It's just gorgeous.
So,
what a lovely tradition.
And then we also inherited the cradle that these 10 children have used, and we're still using it.
Still using it for your baby?
Yeah. Do we have that?
Which grandma is this?
Okay, this is her when she got to be older.
Is this Barbara? How
This is
old?
Barbara. This is after
Barbara.
10 children and about 50 years in Murphy's.
Canning and working and
Yeah,
1915 or so. That
Yeah.
tending the garden, and how many
Yeah.
children?
10, yeah. And then
Lord.
we had the chairs in our dining room today, and then they cut off the legs on the table, and my sister uses it for a coffee table. So.
Oh, gee, that is
Yeah.
neat.
And then this is Peter.
Oh, look at that beard. What an interesting old guy. Let me see if I can see a resemblance. I don't know, John. I think there's a nose there.
I've never had a beard that long.
Okay, and who's this?
Okay, this is
John J. Snyder.
John J. Snyder. He was the a district attorney in Calaveras County
Right.
around the turn of the century.
An
And-
older brother to
Yeah. Yeah.
to my father.
Yeah.
Gee, there was a judge in your family, too, wasn't
Yeah.
there?
Well, that was George Snyder. He was Justice of the Peace in Murphy's back in the 1930s and 1940s, also an attorney. There were 6 boys in the family, 5 of whom became attorneys, all
Wow.
self-taught. They didn't go to institutions of higher learning, but would work in other people's law offices to learn the trade. And
You know, it's really interesting that you'll find a family like this where you just have a lot of public service, and it's
Yeah.
this is the judge?
No, this is John's father, and you might see more of a resemblance of him in there.
Oh, no, I think you look more like the old bearded.
I don't know.
Yeah. And Charlie was a teacher first.
He was first a teacher. When
Now,
he
Charlie is your father.
Charles
Yeah. Okay.
Peter Snyder, right. He got out of grammar school and took a teacher's examination. After he
As so
finished
many
the
of them
out
did.
grade, he got
Right.
a teaching certificate to teach the lower grades when he was within a year or so out of grammar
Well, you know
school.
what I find unusual about that, having delved quite a bit in local history, is that so many women did this. You know, they would get up
Yes,
through the 8th grade and then they would teach the younger grades. But men didn't often become teachers. They become principals or masters or...
Well, I
But not
think
too
they
many.
had to go through the steps. I mean, first you had to probably learn to be a teacher, and then you became an administrator.
Right, right.
And
But so
then-
many of them, it was a women's job. And,
Yeah.
and now,
More so.
They were really in, as I recall, one retired teacher telling me that they wanted more men in the occupation, but it was just, women did it.
Right.
Well, Annie was another one of their siblings, and she was a teacher. She taught you.
Annie Halsell?
Annie Snyder.
No,
Annie
Annie
Snyder?
Snyder, Annie Snyder Radjo, who was 2 years older than my father, was a teacher for many years in the Calaveras
In the-
school system. And when I was in the 2nd grade in the San Andreas Elementary School, she was my
Oh, so
teacher.
you had her as your teacher.
Yeah, I had an aunt who was my teacher.
Oh, nice.
And didn't she ride a horse to work then, or was that
which
Did
is-
she drive a horse to work, or was that?
Oh, no.
Or you ended up with her horse?
Well,
or
well, that
something?
was her daughter, Ramona Radjo
Oh, okay.
Lane, who became a teacher about 1920, and who lived in San Andreas but rode a horse out to about where Sierra Vista Lookout is. There was a grammar school out there known as Mount Tamaulipas, and Ramona rode a horse every day, left San Andreas, you know, about daylight, rode about 7 miles, I believe it was. Taught
Must have been up the back way because
well,
that.
out
whoa.
past the Philippine Ranch and Hoffer Ranch,
oh,
and
yeah.
then rode back at night. She said that the horse went very slowly going to the school, but she came home at neck break speed in the evenings. And yes, the horse was a buckskin mare named Cookie, and that was about 1920, and about 1921 I was born, and my father got this mare from Ramona after she got married and quit teaching, and my first horse.
Did she wear skirts on this horse?
I
I can't
think
imagine
they
teachers
wore.
not.
I think they wore split skirts, and but she rode straddle the horse, not.
She did ride a straddle.
Not side saddle, but in
Boy.
later years, she used to help us drive cattle on the ranch and going to the mountains, and she wore pants,
Pants. You know,
like
that's
Levi's.
interesting too, because our historians want to tell us that women were this prim and proper person, but in
Yes.
California, I think California women just broke all of the rules. They rode horses, they helped with the cattle, they did everything, and that's marvelous. That's wonderful. What else do you have to show me?
Well, here's another one of the house. We're kind
Okay,
of
now we're back in Murphy's, and
Yeah.
this is this old family Snyder house.
on French Gulch Road, and the property is now owned by Larry and Carla Smith.
Okay, that's behind the winery,
Yeah.
kind
And-
of up the hill.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and then here's a long view of the house, and the story has it they started out with that part on front, and then every time they had another kid, they
Add another,
added-
well,
added
if you have 10 kids, you have to do something.
yeah. And we got the pump hole, and then
I believe the house eventually had about 10 rooms in it. Started with 4 and was expanded to
To
10.
accommodate the whole family. So it's gone now, though.
The house has been torn down, or
Yeah,
maybe
it's too
7 or
bad.
8 years
yeah.
ago.
Let's see. And he said in 1932 they had a 100th birthday party for the grandfather,
Uh-huh.
and in 1982 we had a 150th birthday.
He wasn't there.
No,
Neither.
but we had a birthday cake, and we invited the Houselts and about 60 or 70 relatives, and Larry and Carla let us have the party
that's
right in the front yard.
marvelous.
So sometime after 82 they tore down that house and replaced it with
Tell
a
me,
new
what
one.
got you interested in your family's roots, Moon?
Just like a New Year's resolution. It was just
I'm gonna do it, huh?
An urge, and then I started.
Did the book Roots have anything to do with it? I mean, there was kind of a movement after the Roots
Maybe.
book came out.
Possibly.
Yeah, but that
A lot
was
of people.
a few years earlier, but somewhere in my mind it was like
It started
a New
working.
Year's resolution. So I started asking Dad questions, and then I asked his sisters questions, and the first treasure box I got was 47 pounds, and that included these dresses and that old suitcase,
Oh,
and the letters, and the land deeds, and the land patents, and I think our aunt, which would be his sister, was so glad to get rid of it all.
And have somebody be interested.
Yeah, to pass it on down. So she'd received it from the Aunt Louise, who'd be the youngest sister of all these 10
All those 10
children.
children.
Yeah, and we only regret we didn't get her interested earlier before she was gone,
Because
because
then you could have gotten more
more.
information.
But it's like going on a diet, like I said, until you're interested.
It doesn't work until you're interested.
No, it doesn't.
I remember you telling me earlier that one story about one of your relatives was in the earthquake. Is it?
That was this Aunt Louise,
This was
my
Aunt
father's
Louise,
youngest
too.
sister, and the youngest of the 10 children of Peter.
So she actually left Murphy's. She was born in Murphy's,
She
and
was
then
born
she
in
left,
Murphy's.
somehow settled in San Francisco. And she was
Right,
there
moved to
during the
San
earthquake.
Francisco, I believe to first become an actress.
Oh,
And after the earthquake of 1906, which she went through, she then became a legal secretary and spent about 50 years as a legal secretary in San Francisco. And I believe she died about 1970 at around 80 years of age.
right.
Yeah.
So she lived through the earthquake, and
In fact, the property in Murphy's, even after the grandfather and grandfather Peter and Barbara died in 1911 and 1912, stayed in the Snyder family all those years. And it was you guys sold it to help pay her last years. Wasn't that the deal?
I think so.
Yeah,
It
that's
was
what it-
divided
yeah.
up into
Yeah.
some interests were only like 1/27th, you know, and there were that
Yeah,
many
right.
heirs, so it
Yeah.
was decided it was probably better to sell it and take care of this surviving aunt. And Dr. Ben Smith, Larry Smith's father, bought the property about 1970,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
so Jay was in the family till 1970. That's incredible.
Yeah.
So you guys are in Valley Springs, and Pete Snyder, who's also related to you, was San Andreas for years. In fact, his building downtown San Andreas
right.
is still there.
Well,
And that's Pete.
that's Peter Snyder. His father was Jacob Snyder, who was an older brother
Yeah.
of my father.
Okay, so your father and Pete's father were brothers.
yeah.
And this is he?
Yeah, this is Pete holding that watermelon.
No, that's Jake,
Oh, Pete's.
Pete's father.
yeah.
Pete's father.
Yeah. They came back from the state fair with the produce that year.
Well, this is kind of an
Yeah.
interesting old picture
Yeah.
because
Charles Getchell and George Treat and Jacob Snyder was driving. It was taken in front of the Hotel Leger in McCollum Hill. And I think they'd all been to the state fair for showing off Calaveras County.
well, they sure did. That's a
produce.
huge watermelon and a huge cabbage. Is that a cabbage?
Yeah, I think they took produce from Calaveras County down to show the people in the rest of the state what we could do.
I guess so. That cabbage must be, well, it must be
Huge.
that big. Marvelous. Okay, read to me a little bit from your.
Okay. This was Aunt Louise's book. In 1906, she was a legal secretary and an actress in San Francisco. And she was reading this book about April 28th, okay.
What's the name of the book?
It's called The Octopus by Frank Norris, and it's about the...
Well, it's a story of how the railroads, primarily Southern Pacific, ruled the state legislatively,
Right,
you know,
right.
and it's an
So that's-
interesting book
Yes,
as well
it's
as...
very famous.
Yeah, so anyway, she had grabbed this book and a few other things, and she came back to Murphy's eventually April 28th, and she wrote that she said, now that I feel as though I can collect my thoughts and try to scribble in this book the events of my life since the 18th in San Francisco. She was rudely awakened this morning about 5:10 o'clock by the crashing of glass as a marble-top table in my room was thrown to the floor. And she saw that the whole house was shaking furiously. She stood by the door expecting every minute to have the plaster fall in, for it didn't. She was truly thankful. And she could hear women shrieking and the streets falling
People
in.
running around in their nightgowns and their underwear.
And it was one of the worst earthquakes that San Francisco known. The buildings all suffered more than the damage, the wooden buildings. And the glass was shaking and the streets were falling in. And anyway, she goes on and does an accounting of her next few days of getting out of San Francisco, which was difficult, and then how the family in Murphy's was worried about her.
Oh, because they didn't have telephones,
no.
they couldn't phone. Of course, they would have never gotten through anyway, just like our most recent one.
Their communications weren't quite as good.
No, but even if they're as good, it doesn't matter. We couldn't get through.
Yeah, so-
I know during the most recent earthquake, it's interesting to know, and I don't know if you know this, that there's a society that collects earthquake stories, and you really should copy this off
Yeah.
and send it to them because it's kind of nice to have that big collection in an
Yeah,
archive.
yeah. So
And
she
of course,
just
she ate, what did she eat? Graham crackers and stuff?
graham crackers and malted balls and some cheese, and then they ended up in Golden Gate Park and actually camped for the night, she and her girlfriend.
They probably had tents. I know they had a lot of tents in
Yeah.
Golden Gate Parks for the
Yeah.
earthquake survivors.
Yeah, and then she got on a ferry and came across to Oakland and then took the train to Stockton, and we had relatives there. And then your father,
Picked her up in
Yeah.
Milton, I believe.
Yeah.
And so they got
no,
you.
At Milton?
Knew she was safe and everything
Yeah,
was
I
fine.
believe the railroad was as far as Milton by that
yeah,
time.
from Stockton to Milton.
Well, you know, I've often, especially since the most recent San Francisco earthquake, I've heard people say, well, what would you take out of your house if it was going to be destroyed by an earthquake or some kind of catastrophe or, you know, a fire, flood, or whatever? What would you take out? And of course, your aunt had that experience. What
Yeah.
did she take out? Let's look. We have a little treasure box down here to share with you. And they really are a delight.
Yeah, this thing was a holding the thread for sewing.
Like would you call it a
Let's see, I guess you
bobbin?
screwed it. This little bird. Yeah.
It's really interesting. It's so different
Yeah.
than anything I've ever seen before. What would you say this metal is, John? Do you think it's silver?
Pewter, I
Pewter?
suppose. It's a relatively soft metal.
It looks like there might have been something else attached to
Yeah.
it.
Maybe something to hold the spool of thread.
Oh yeah. That would fit up there.
Oh,
Anyway,
yeah.
this screwed on the table, and little kids learn to sew.
Maybe what you have in your left hand screws into fits in the top up here, did it? That small, in the other way, maybe.
Oh, well, I can't imagine. There's,
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure how it would work either, but it's an interesting piece. And it is a treasure.
Oh
What
yeah,
a
she
lovely
grabbed this
treasure.
stuff and her book.
It must have meant something to her.
Yeah.
Okay, and what else did you
Well, there was a ring that belonged to the relatives, but she grabbed this with a
chain?
yeah.
Okay, so she took her sewing bobbin, we think, a ring,
Yeah, and then we never figured out what.
but it's also, is it this silver, do you think, John?
Gee, I'm not sure. It's some kind
It
of a
looks like it could
small,
be tarnished silver,
yeah,
like it's a-
fancy tool. I think it's silver, but it's badly corroded. It has some initials. It's tarnished, not corroded, but it could
Yeah,
be
tarnished.
polished up to.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. And then this bag was a coin bag.
Gee, yes.
Must have had coins in it. I haven't
Like
seen.
Well,
buckskin,
by the time we
maybe?
could- yeah.
Yeah.
But it was her Peter and Barbara's, her parents, and it's pretty historic, we think.
I guess so.
And then a coin.
Do you think it was typical of the day for Grandma to carry money in a coin bag around her neck? My grandmother did, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
Do you think they did that? They carried them close to their bodies?
Yeah. And before that, they carried their gold in them, maybe.
Oh, they were gold dust. Grandma with her gold dust.
Yeah.
That's a good image.
Yeah.
And here we have a coin?
Yeah,
Is this part of the treasure too?
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it's a German coin or. It's,
Wilhelm
Sounds German.
Kung. Yes,
Yeah.
German. I can't read German, so I won't try.
yeah, but she grabbed those things, and they were in this 47 pounds of stuff that I got the first time, too.
That is a nice treasure
Yeah.
to have, something that you can really enjoy. Well, to try and recap now, we have the Snyders we know came here in the early days for the gold rush, and your grandmother had 10 children in Murphy's, and then of course they scattered and went thither and non. How many have stayed in the county?
Well, with the exception of my family, me and my family, just Peter's family.
That's your cousin.
Cousin Peter, who passed away several years ago. He has two sons, Kenny Snyder, who's a mechanic.
And he's here in the county?
Yeah, just about 2 miles south of San Andreas on Highway 49. And Gary Snyder, who with his mother operated the Peter Snyder Insurance Agency until it was sold, I believe, in this past year. And the rest of them have scattered from Washington State to Southern California.
Yeah. And then Dad made an interesting point is, on a lot of people's family tree, it gets bigger as you go down. Ours was big at the top and got smaller.
Yeah.
And he said something to do with the length of the generations. How old was Peter?
Well, when my father was born, my grandfather was in his early 40s. And when I was born in 1921, my father was 47 years old. So we really only have about half the generations of people who have children every 20 years, you know.
Right. Exactly.
So ours got smaller as we went down.
And in my,
so how many children do you have?
Well, I have 4 daughters. My father had 3 daughters and 1 son, me. And none of my sisters had any children, so my children, 4 daughters, of which Moon is the youngest, are the only, grandchildren of my father. Peter Snyder, like I say, had 2 boys, and one of them has 2 boys and a girl. And it just seems like many of my cousins, of which there were about 20 originally.
And you were younger than all those cousins?
I was about the youngest of that generation. I had cousins who were 20 years older than I was.
Well, what did your grandfather do for a living then? Was he a rancher when did he make it good in the gold?
Yes, he mined, I think, when he came to Murphy's, and probably not too successfully, but he did acquire about 260 acres of land on the west side of Murphy's, one parcel, 160 acres where the home was, and then I think there was 110 acres out on the 6 Mile Road between Murphy's and Douglas Flat, Vallecito, that area. And yes, he raised grapes. I know he made wine, and
did he drink a little wine too?
Oh yes, he might have been one of the first vintners up there. But apparently was able to raise this family of 9 children, largely off of the land.
Well, of course, in those days, because it was agriculture, children were an advantage rather than a disadvantage, because you had workers.
But I think there was about 20 years difference between the youngest and the oldest children.
Well, that is stretching it out.
And as the older children became old enough, they would
leave and
either
go
work out or leave, right. And so they had a, you know, if not a great wealthy life, they were comfortable.
Certainly, certainly.
Yes.
And that's nice. And then how about you? Now you, how did you end up on a ranch in Valley Springs, since you're sort of a Murphy's location here?
Well, my father became an attorney, first practiced in Angels Camp, then he became district attorney at Calaveras County, moved to San Andreas, and I was born here in San Andreas and went to school here, as did my 3 sisters. But my father, all his life, wanted to raise cattle. So about the time I was born, I believe about 1920, he bought some land just north of San Andreas in the Central Hill area, and raised cattle. And then the ranch where I live, he bought in 1929 from the Manuel estate, an old family from Murphy's.
I remember that name.
And so from the time I was a small boy, I wanted to be a cowboy. And like I told you before, my cousin Ramona Lane had this buckskin mare named Cookie that was my horse from about 19 26 or so. I think I started riding when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I had that horse up till 1939, I believe. And,
Oh, my.
and
And then you guys used to drive your cattle by foot all the way from Valley Springs or Central Hill clear to Post Corral.
yes, my
Okay,
father.
where's Post Corral, though?
Well,
Because our viewers
it's in,
probably don't know.
Post Corral's in Tuolumne County at about the 6,500-foot elevation between the north and middle forks of the Stanislaus River.
Okay, so he, in other words, had winter range, summer range, rather.
Yeah, he acquired a Forest
Like
Service permit in
like
the
so many
National
have.
Forest, and yes, cattle were driven.
That was a long way, though.
Well,
to go
from Valley Springs to Post Corral was about 70 miles,
Yeah,
and
that's a
it
long
was
way.
about a 4 or 5 day trip horseback.
And you did this, of course.
Well, I think I was 8 years old before they let me ride a horse all that way, but then for 20 years or so, we drove cattle up until...
How about you? Did you ever go on into the cattle drives?
Well, we go now to Tuolumne County on Highway 108. It's a different range.
Right. Our
Yeah.
family has a cattle range over 50 miles east of Sonora on Highway 108, Eagle Meadows, and we take cattle over there. I have for 11 or 12 years.
So the girls, do all of your girls get out and ride
Well,
the cattle?
2 of them are interested in the cattle with us, and 2 of them are not. 2 of them live in Texas, and
Oh, I
2
see.
live in California.
But I've never been to Post Corral, and I'd like to do that.
Well, we should.
I can
we
do that.
should
things
do
wholesome.
that.
Yeah, I'd like to do that.
When we first started going up there, like around 1930, I believe, we had to pack into our camp. You could only drive within about 5 miles of where the cow camp was. So we used to drive up Highway 4 to Big Meadows, then drive down a terribly narrow, rough, steep dirt road to Sand Flats. Do you know where that would be?
No,
On the-
none of those places are really familiar, but I'm sure that anybody watching who
Yes,
knows that area would be.
There were a couple of Boy Scout camps down on the Stanislaus River, and then it was about a 5-mile trail up Highland Creek, just below Spicer Meadows Dam, where the new North Fork project
Oh,
is,
yes,
you know.
okay, now I know that
And
area pretty well.
we'd go into a camp there, and a log cabin. It had been built right on the range out of the native materials. In fact, Fred Schwerer, who was Charlie Schwerer's father, was a partner of my father's on the Post Corral Range originally, and he and a helper built this log cabin in 12 days. And it was a cabin about probably 18 by 24 feet, 2 stories, and gee, a nice old cabin that...
Is it still standing, did you say?
It eventually collapsed and fell
gosh, that's
down,
too
and I believe the Forest Service didn't want any more
Yeah,
improvements.
they don't. They wanted
up
to
there,
discourage
but,
them.
But since that time, the Segali brothers, you probably have heard of them from Murphy's,
Right.
owned land right in the area, and they put roads in to take out Christmas trees and haul out logs, and eventually it got very easy to
get in and out.
to get in and out of the cabin. But when my father was an attorney here in San Andreas, he would oftentimes after work on Friday nights drive from San Andreas to Big Meadows to Sand Flats, then walk. It was an hour-and-a-half's walk, many times in the dark.
Yeah, didn't you say that we didn't have flashlights in those days, so
No.
you used a can? And,
Well, yes, they used to take a coffee can, you know, and put a wire bale handle on it, punch a hole in the side of it, and put a candle inside that coffee can. And the reflection of the shiny interior of the coffee can made a acceptable light. And it was about 1 candle's trip. In other words, it took...
A one-candle walk.
Yeah, 1 candle would about illuminate the trail. And you only needed that when there was no moon. When it was moonlight, it was nice. You know, you could see almost every rock and bush and tree, and those were memories that I could remember as a kid. I used to walk, follow him with the lamp, and we'd go in and spend the weekend at the camp, and walk out on Sunday afternoon and drive home. And
Now, you still do cattle. You don't only do powwow.
well, we have had cattle since 1946.
So that's I'm not very good with my arithmetic.
Well, that's roughly 40
years.
7 years.
47 years.
40.
Gee, that's getting up there.
Right.
You're going to have a big party on the 50th?
Rice, we're having our powwow the first weekend of May, first, second, and
no,
third.
I mean a cattle party up in the range.
Well,
Oh yeah, we got an occasion coming up. In 1994, they will be married 50 years. So
Oh, wow.
you need an excuse for a party or
Yes.
whatever.
Well, I was just looking for an invitation.
Oh, sure. Well, we raise registered Hereford bulls, and we sell them to cattlemen and other people. So every year, the first Saturday of August, we have a barbecue up on our range, and we invite.
Is that kind of traditional among cattlemen? That they
Well, it
do that
is
today?
if you are trying to cultivate them as bull riding customers. But we also invite our friends, and any of you are certainly welcome
Oh, well, thank you.
to come and join us on.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'll probably come.
Welcome.
Well, it was nice to meet you.
And the crew
Moon.
here.
I really enjoyed doing this, and I had never met, well, I may have met you because I've been down to powwow.
I know you.
But not to really talk to and get to know and to discuss the family history, so it's been a lot of fun. I've certainly enjoyed seeing all your treasures. I had no idea you had a wedding dress. I've never seen you in that. So this has been a delight. I appreciate you coming. Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank you.
very good. Thank you.